welcome. I think we'll get started. There probably will still be a few people who come in finding their way up to the lecture hall here. I'm Sunil Kilnani, and I'm the director of the King's India Institute. And here at the India Institute, our approach is really driven by two connected purposes. On the one hand, an interest in understanding contemporary India through a multiplicity of disciplinary and intellectual perspectives, and in engaging with it in the public domain as well. And in that sort of twofold project that we're setting out to meet, we quite consciously draw on a tradition of public intellectuals in India and elsewhere, who themselves did both. That's to say, who at once enriched our understanding of contemporary India, as they also worked to change its practical possibilities. And as a sort of homage to that tradition, we're establishing a series of annual lectures to honor the memory of some of its most recent, notable recent exponents. Sarvepalli Gopal, or Dr. Gopal as he was always known, ranks as one of modern India's foremost historians. He was born on the 23rd of April, 1926. Just a few days earlier, this week marked his birth anniversary. And in a career stretching 5 decades, he established himself as an outstanding historical biographer, a political historian, a meticulous editor, a teacher, and a public intellectual who moved in the corridors of power and published in the popular press. His 3-volume biography of Nehru remains a landmark, and as the first editor of the selected works of Jawaharlal Nehru, he gave shape to one of the most significant published sources for understanding modern India's history. He was a professor at Jawaharlal Nehru University, and he was also a fellow of St. Anthony's College, Oxford. And there, at both of those places, he mentored a generation or more of historians and helped to define an agenda for research in modern Indian history. But most unusually, I think, for a scholar such as he was, Dr. Gopal also had a career in government. Within the Ministry of External Affairs, he helped to make the historical division a vital force, and he directed the division's activities for over a decade. He became involved in developing briefs used in the discussions with the Chinese over the boundary dispute in India. And as such, he also played a role in that historical episode. In recent decades, the kind of history that Gopal did, the themes and questions he explored, the limpid style in which he wrote, have been very much out of fashion. And so too has the broadly liberal tenor of his politics. But that may be beginning to change, and I hope so. And I hope if we have anything to do to help that, that would be one of the purposes of this series. A collection of his articles and essays, including some unpublished ones, will appear next year, edited by one of our colleagues, Srinath Raghavan. And we hope that occasions such as this one will also draw attention to some of the themes he made his own. I should say we're very pleased indeed that we have the endorsement of Gopal's family, his widow and his nephew, to host such a lecture. And I'm also pleased, I think there's a member of the family representing the family here, or was due to be here. I'm not sure if she's here. There, yeah, thank you. Let me now turn to our speaker this evening. And in all honesty, I don't think there could be a more appropriate person to deliver the inaugural S. Gopal Memorial Lecture. Professor Sir Christopher Bailey is the Vere Harmsworth Professor of Imperial and Naval History in the University of Cambridge, and he's also Fellow and President of St. Catharine's College, Cambridge. And more appropriate, of course, in large part because he's simply the most distinguished historian of modern India working anywhere in the world today. In a publishing career that now spans pretty much 40 years, Professor Bailey has researched and written about virtually every aspect of the subcontinent's modern history, from the minutiae of local politics in the city of Allahabad in the early 20th century, and I'll come back to this, his first book, to pioneering studies of information networks and how local knowledge was produced in the 19th century, to early merchant capitalism in North India, and to India and Southeast Asia during the Second World War. More recently, he's also been a leading figure in the development of the new field of global history with his remarkable book, The Birth of the Modern. And just at the end of last year, he published a landmark study of Indian intellectual history, Recovering Liberties, Indian Thought in the Age of Liberalism and Empire. And that book will actually be the subject of a symposium to be held by us here at the Institute later in the year, at the end of November. His work has brought him many honors, the Fellow of the British Academy, recipient of the Wolfson Prize, a knighthood in 2007 for his services to history, and it's also engaged him in public life. He's a trustee of the British Museum, among various other public offices he holds. But there are also other more personal reasons, I think, which make him particularly appropriate to give this first lecture in memory of S. Gopal. And they directly relate to the beginning of his career, and also, I think, to his more recent book. As a student at Balliol College in Oxford in the 1960s, Chris was for a time a student of Sarvepalli Gopal's, just when the latter was beginning the research that resulted in his biography of Nehru. And I believe it was Gopal who first suggested to Chris that he might work on the political microcosm of Allahabad, the home of the Nehrus, and for a few brief decades, an epicenter of Indian political life. Professor Bailey's recent study of Indian liberal thought traces the development and apparent fall of that tradition. And among the last liberals he discusses is Gopal's father, Radhakrishnan, a philosopher who served as India's president. With Nehru, and certainly with the generation after Nehru, Chris Bailey sees a definite political extinction of the liberal lineage in India. And his lecture this evening is about that intellectual circle and generation that coalesced around Nehru, of whom Gopal was part. But before we turn to that, just two practical things. There won't be questions after the lecture, but you are all invited to join us for drinks, which will be served in the small Somerset room. It's down on the second floor. And there you'll have a chance to meet informally with Professor Bailey. And so now to our lecture this evening, entitled Development and Sentiment, Sarvepalli Gopal and the Political Thought of Nehru's India. Chris.
Well, thank you, Sunil. It's a great honor to give the first S. Gopal Memorial Lecture, and I'd like to thank Professor Khilnani and the board of King's India Institute for the privilege. I'm going to discuss the ideologies, sensibilities, and aspirations of the key figures of the age of Jawaharlal Nehru and his period of office as first Prime Minister of independent India between 1947 and 1964. Sarvepalli Gopal himself wrote 4 key volumes on these years, as we've been told. His 3-volume study of Jawaharlal Nehru himself and biography of his father, Sarvepalli Radhakrishnan, who was the second president of India. In a sense, then, Gopal was the official historian of early independent India. So I'll first mention some features of his historical writing. Gopal, reader in Indian history at Oxford, was my key mentor, as Sunil said, during my doctorate at St. Anthony's College in the late 1960s. His mixture of shrewdness and candor was later revealed when I realized why it suggested that I work on the politics of the city of Allahabad. At the time, he was shifting his own interest from studies of British viceroys to the biography of Nehru, whose home was, of course, Allahabad. I heard very much later that Gopal was inclined to gently caricature my detailed local prosopographical work, typical of that era, as, I quote, 1 Brahmin equals 3 Vaishyas equals 6 Kayastas, or words to that effect. But in my defense, I would only suggest that if the Brahmins and Kayastas in question were Motilal and Jawaharlal Nehru, Indira Gandhi, Madan Mohan Malaviya, and Rajendra Prasad, all key figures in Indian struggle for independence, then there was perhaps something to be said for my study, antiquated as it now seems. Actually, Gopal was an ideal figure to have in the common rooms of Oxford, which in those days were still alive with immediate post-colonial condescension. With his Brahminical status, poise, hauteur and wonderful command of English, he had a remarkable capacity to reduce annoying racialist creatures, as he put it, to shocked silence. His work displays a similar aloof grandeur. Dipesh Chakrabarti has recently located a Thucydidean style in Indian historiography, one that strongly emphasizes the political over the social or Herodotean version, and pictures both elites and subalterns struggling with the problems of their respective life worlds. Often this Thucydidean theme has been tinged with a notion of the heroic, the hero leader, sometimes a leader doomed to failure, in the case, for instance, of the historian Sajjadanath Sarkar's vision of the political struggles of the 18th century Indian leaders. Gopal was definitely a historian in the Thucydidean guise. His earliest works depicted British viceroys, alien and ignorant, though occasionally enlightened, battling with nationalist aspirations they could never understand, and Indian political leaders struggling Laocoon-like with the serpent of colonialism. Later, his depiction of Jawaharlal Nehru extended the heroic trope. Nehru was a great liberal leader, horrified by the early events of independence, which he had craved: communal massacre, compromise with the dying British imperialism through Dominion status and the Commonwealth, the assassination of Gandhi, and the Cold War. Even in the final volume of Gopal's biography of Nehru, the statesman is shackled by the persistence of poverty and in his final years wrecked by the confrontation with China, which should have been a friend. Similarly, Radhakrishnan, Gopal's father, emerges as a flawed hero in this biography, or is it in fact his own semi-autobiography? Radhakrishnan's ideology was, Gopal claims, one of civilized individualism, and he was a proponent of the tolerance and inclusiveness of India and the Indian spirit against all the problems thrown at it, from internal communal conflict to the persistence of imperialism in the international arena. Yet, Gopal insists, Radhakrishnan was no plaster saint, as was demonstrated by aspects of his personal life and also by his compromised position on various issues of public policy, notably religion. Nevertheless, he was one of the great transformative personalities of our age. Gopal's superb command of the rhetorical form of the English language is often reminiscent of Carlyle. Gopal was therefore the preeminent historian of the Nehruvian era of Indian politics. And how does his assessment of the era stand up now, a decade after his death and half a century after those years? I'll try to reinterpret his work in the light of the new style of Indian intellectual history, which has been developed by Andrew Sartori, Shruti Kapila, Faisal Devji, and Sunil himself, among others. My own approach is to create a politically contextualized history of ideas. But rather than tracing a concept such as development or non-alignment, I'll examine the life worlds of several key individuals. For Indian intellectual history, there is no firm canon of works, so that in addition to examining the often contradictory speech acts of public figures, we need to take into account what I call their meaningful practices. Together, these constituted what Raymond Geuss terms an amalgam of historically contingent fragments and ideologies. The more fluid because it emerged in a multilingual and multicultural polity, long subject to the constraints of foreign dominion. So first of all, I'll talk about partition, tragedy, and development. I'll consider the ideologies and sentiments with which Nehru and members of his circle approached the key event and the greatest tragedy of 20th century South Asia, partition, because it's not really possible to understand the post-independence state in isolation from partition. According to Nehru himself, the whole history of India, of assimilation, of cultural difference, pointed towards the gradual emergence of a sense of unity, as he wrote in his book, The Discovery of India. The masses of Hindus and Muslims were hardly distinguishable from each other, he says. It was only recent psychological and economic differences between Hindus and Muslims, middle class in particular, which made Muslim separatism even plausible. Pakistan was no solution for economic and social backwardness. On the contrary, it was likely to strengthen the whole of feudal elements, as Nehru called them, and delay the economic process and progress of Muslims. Yet, as against this idealism, an important aspect of the prevailing sentiment of 1945 to 48 was a widespread view amongst Congress leaders, intellectuals, and the business community that in Gopal's world, while India should not be a theocratic state as such, it should nevertheless be a state which symbolized the interests of the Hindu majority. This view Gopal attributed to a wide range of Nehru's supporters and rivals, such as Vallabhbhai Patel and Rajendra Prasad. Their position was supported by Shyama Prasad Mukherjee and a large part of the Congress leadership in Bengal. It was also fiercely backed by the Hindu Mahasabha, the Hindu majoritarian organization. The issue was not so much religion as such, but territorial coherence and the identity of the new state. It therefore provides a context for the ideas of economic development, which is the main issue I want to discuss in this lecture. This sentimental and territorial coherence of the state provided the background to the deliberations of the Cabinet Mission of 1946, when two federated unions, Pakistan and Hindustan, weakly linked at the center, were under consideration. It also informed the rapid and epical decisions to enact a complete partition of the subcontinent made by Mountbatten and the political leadership between May and August 1947. In fact, historians have probably overstated the support amongst congressmen themselves for a completely secular and inclusive state along Nehru's lines. Majority opinion seems to have favored a state for Hindus, just as Jinnah called for a state for Muslims, though not, of course, an Islamic state. This perhaps helps to provide an ideological background to the ultimate acquiescence of much of the Indian leadership in the complete partition of the subcontinent, painful as it was for them. Jinnah himself drew attention to this symmetry, citing a great professor, Dr. Gadgil, whom I'll be speaking about later, to the effect that a Hindu state, or more fully a federation of Hindu national states, is the only proper description of the new Indian Union. To call it a Hindu state brings out, he says, its dominant and most significant characteristics. This was Gadgil. Gadgil, director of the Gokhale Institute in Pune, and later one of the key intellectual forces behind Nehru's economic planning, serves as an important gauge of Indian intellectual history over this period. In 1946, during the deliberations of the Cabinet Mission, Gadgil wrote The Federal Problem in India. This tract was not published by the Gokhale Institute until 1947, by which time full partition was on the table. But it illustrates a wide range of Hindu opinion. It stated, and I quote, "Muslims and Hindus in India must be considered as not forming one community, but two communities desirous of cultivating traditions which are in the main divergent. It was not possible or desirable for Hindu and Muslim regions to be forced into a union. Hence, a Muslim and a non-Muslim federation must come into existence." Gadgil wrote of Muslims as, I quote, "a tight-knit community." Conversely, though some Hindus were heavily impregnated with the results of past Muslim rule, a large number of regions do not share these traditions, and demanding the rebuilding of society on Hindu foundations. Implicitly, some form of division was essential. In this respect, the Hindu Mahasabha, the integralist Hindu party, was an equivalent of the Muslim League. Unfortunately, Gadgil thought these two bodies couldn't agree because the Mahasabha still clung to the irrational and mystic cry for the integrity of India. Here, Gadgil's ideas bore a striking similarity to those of the Dalit, the untouchable leader, B.R. Ambedkar, who was soon to be also a founding figure of the early Republic of India. Ambedkar went further than Gadgil, arguing that the Muslims were not simply a community, they were a nation in the sense understood by Ernst Renan, the French philosopher. Hindus and Muslims had opposing historical myths. Their imagined historical communities, in Benedict Anderson's sense, were fundamentally different. The future West Pakistan, at least, had a common language and was economically self-sufficient. Both Gadgil and Ambedkar were worried by the immediate problem of the potential splits within the Indian army between Muslim, Sikh, and Hindu. Both of them also pondered the recent history of multi-ethnic empires and federal states, the former Ottoman Empire, the United States, Austro-Hungary, and Czechoslovakia. For Ambedkar, looking into the past, forcibly holding the Greeks within the Ottoman state or the Czechs within Czechoslovakia eventually guaranteed the collapse of these polities. Gadgil looked into the future, even if India, meaning the whole territory of British India, could be held together. He envisaged a gradual escalation of intercommunal tensions so that after the 10-year period of accommodation set by the Cabinet Mission Plan, a more dangerous breakup was likely to occur. Both Gadgil and Ambedkar also feared that in any surviving union, the centre could not hold. The union government would be colourless, in Gadgil's words, and unable to raise taxation for defence, welfare provision, or the development of communications. Many of these concerns emerged strongly in the Constituent Assembly debates of 1946 to 1949. Their priorities in the area were, however, significantly different. Gadgil had already written much about the need for central state support for rural development. Ambedkar agreed, but his more immediate concern was the fate of the Dalits, the untouchables. The state would have to act rapidly to counter the scandal of intouchability through reservation policy. Internal slavery, he wrote, was no better than the enslavement by an external master such as the British. The state, contrary to Hegel, didn't represent the march of God on earth. Instead, it should be a pragmatic and democratic form devoted to the alleviation of inequality. In fact, the further we go beyond Nehru himself, even in his own inner circle, we find a great deal of ambivalence towards the territorial status of Muslims in India, both before and after partition. If we take the case of Gobind Ballabh Pant, the UP leader and the chief minister of the state, we detect an intellectual stance closer to the Hindu Mahasabha than to Nehru, Pant's revered leader. It's true that Pant objected vigorously to the Mahasabha's call for direct action against partition in 1947, but his language, symbolism, and what I called meaningful practices constantly tipped towards Hindu populism. His convocation address to the University of Allahabad in December 1946 on the unity of India seems at first like a paraphrase of Nehru's discovery of India and contained the usual gestures towards the Mughal Emperor Akbar as the fount of communal harmony. Yet in this speech, India rapidly became the land of the Hindu sages, beginning with Kapala and ending with Bhaskar. The recently deceased Madan Mohan Malavir, once described to me by Gopal as a communalist, and certainly someone distrusted by the Muslim leadership, was a Brahma Rishi, according to Pant. Allahabad was Prayag, a blessed Hindu place. Elsewhere, his language was even clearer. Congress would remove discrimination against Hindi and the Nagri script. While denouncing the two-nation theory of Sir Syed Ahmed Khan, Pant pointed out that Gandhi should be trusted because, above all, he had helped to prevent cow slaughter. Both Nehru's developmentalism and his multi-faith and strongly secularist vision of India and its future had relatively little purchase in 1947 to 50, compared with the more free market stance of most of the Congress, and of course Mountbatten, and the soft Hindu populist stance of many others, notably Patel and Tandon. Nehru also had to fall back on conservative former Indian ICS officers who'd been involved in wartime economic governance, somewhat to his own discomfiture. Nehru, observed Gopal, didn't expect his officials to be partner in ideology. In addition, Nehru's own liberal stance on popular representation and democracy was in conflict with the need to get economic growth moving ahead rapidly. So, most interpretations stress the pragmatic, ad hoc nature of the changes over the first 3 years of independence. Yet I want to argue that this pragmatism was nevertheless inflected by strong but varied ideological commitments which were held both by the Prime Minister and by his immediate circle of supporters, officials, and political allies. So I'll now move on to the ideological sources of Nehru's judgment. Let's first consider Nehru's political judgment, as Sunil Kulnani terms it, in some particular cases. I'm struck above all by Nehru's regular invocation of affect or emotion in his discussion of political concepts, quite unlike the statements of scientific Marxists or even many Indian socialists. Discussing the need to limit the range of nationalization of industry in 1948, Nehru is aware, of course, of Mountbatten's view that large-scale nationalization would deter desperately needed foreign capital from investment in India. He also noted that it was better to spend money building new industries than buying up existing ones, thus implying a degree of compensation to owners which would never have been comprehensible in the cases of the Soviet Union, China, or Vietnam. But Nehru also emphasized the need to retain the goodwill of expert personnel and colleagues. He admitted to a strong tendency towards socialism, but the slate could never be wiped clean, and intelligence demands a gradual approach. Again, he often referred to his own non-doctrinaire version of socialism. Evidently, central planning was needed to diminish inequality and poverty, but this had to be achieved through, quotes, democratic planning without too much compulsion. This emotional contractualism with the populace, even the old elites, as much as fear of right-wing reaction, counseled Nehru to limit zamindari abolition to large landowners while protecting the property of the yeomanry and of the smaller landowners. Reading Nehru's remarks about rural development, one also gets the sense of an almost Ruskin-like emphasis on small-scale improvement, even though he's widely associated only with the promotion of large-scale industry. Nehru was appalled by the poverty which he saw in places such as Kanpur, where big industry had spawned impoverished labouring villages. Of course, Gandhians attacked Nehru's vision, and Radhakamal Mukherjee, the prophet of economic regionalism, denounced Nehru's government for too rapid industrialization. This was, Mukherjee said, to put the cart before the horse. What was needed first was the basic protection and security of living for the people, which could be assured only by the introduction of scientific farming and careful rural planning to peasant holdings, though not through any form of collectivization. Industry should be developed in association with agriculture and not in opposition to it. All the same, it's clear that Mukherjee's and Nehru's positions were not so far apart. Nehru's collectivization was far from Mao Zedong. The Prime Minister praised the examples of refugee settlement and rural uplift powered by panchayats, local deliberative bodies, emphasizing small-scale cooperation rather than development of heavy industries. It seems fair to say that both Nehru and Mukherjee were in large part communitarian liberals in the tradition of G.K. Gokhale before the First World War, though they differed in emphasis. Nehru's generosity was exhibited in the stance he took in international relations, though many would make an exception for his, and for that matter Gopal's, rather more rigid position on the Kashmir issue. Nehru saw India, like Truman's USA, as a great multi-ethnic society which represented the future of humanity better than the smaller European nation-states which had dragged the world to disaster. Earlier, he had referred to G.D.H. Cole's vision of a future Indian democracy lying between the coming socialist societies of China-Japan to the east and an Ottoman Arab Islamic state to the west. Nehru was appalled by the avidity of the great powers and believed in building connections with other emerging post-colonial nations through the spirit of Asia, signalled by the Bandung Pact and his pressure for world peace conferences. This idea of the spirit of Asia had recurred constantly during the 20th century. In Nehru's youth, Okakura Kakuza's work, The Ideals of the East, had deeply influenced Indian intellectuals and Nehru himself. Nehru's generosity of spirit and fine political judgment was most in evidence when dealing with the communal issue during the crisis of partition between 1946 and 48. But he found himself embattled by Hindu reaction on many occasions during his premiership. This was notably the case in 1950, when more than 1 million Hindus fled East Pakistan and there were countervailing attacks on Muslims in India. One of the centers of this new outbreak of Hindu-Muslim discord was UP, Nehru's home state. 200,000 Muslims migrated from the state as they came under pressure, and P.D. Tandon himself, president of the Provincial Congress, urged Muslims to, I quote, adopt Hindu culture. Nehru stamped hard on this sentiment and disciplined his lieutenant, Pant, who was recalled to Delhi. Nehru exhibited, I think, a form of Fabian socialism very close to the communitarian liberalism espoused by Hobhouse, Hobson, Green, and in India, Gokhale before 1914. This politics was inflected with notions of trust, loyalty, and hope, rather than the rigorous political economic analysis favored by India's communists and socialists. A former Harrow and Cambridge-educated theosophist, Nehru himself acknowledged his own complex emotional and ideological heritage, including, I quote, the Indian or the European, for after all, I have that European and English aspect also. So I now look at Nehru's team, Gobind Vallabh Pant, first. So I return to Pant, but this time in his guise as a developmentalist, as a radical Hindu liberal with a, quote, tendency to socialism. Pandit Gobind Vallabh Pant was one of the closest of Jawaharlal Nehru's immediate entourage. Only on Hindu-Muslim problems did he move away from Nehru's inclusive position. Pant's biographer, M. Chalapati Rao, stressed Pant's nation-building role in fashioning the Republic's linguistic provinces, while at the same time praising him for his pragmatism on issues such as nationalization and landlord abolition. In this way, he became, in Rao's view, a somewhat unlikely hybrid of Herbert Asquith and Bismarck. Pant was not an abstract thinker. His sonorous speeches seem mainly to have been sermons to justify his political pragmatism. As Chief Minister of UP and later as Home Minister in the few months before his death in 1961. Yet there were two issues on which Pant deliberated where one gets a sense of a wider intellectual program: rural labor and the role of the state in economic development. As a Brahmin from Almora in the UP Hills, and later a lawyer in Allahabad during the 1919 peasant agitation, Pant grew up with an acute awareness of issues of rural labor. In the later 19th century, the hill region still maintained a system of forced labor, which Pant and his colleagues viewed as a form of slavery. Peasant farmers and rural workers were regularly made to offer personal service or part of their crop to landlords, officials, and the upper castes. In the hill regions, this was particularly onerous, as ordinary people were coerced into carrying crops and other loads up and down the hills for their masters. Here, as across India, these non-monetary perquisites became more valuable as the value of rent became erratic during the Great War and the Depression. Pant was active in the movement to abolish these forms of labor coercion. Yet Pant's own caution and gradualism was very much in evidence when he came to discuss the issue of landlordism both before independence and as Chief Minister of UP after 1948. He made a sharp distinction between the large-scale landlordism in Bengal and the USSR, for instance, and the situation over much of the hills and the Indian plains where smallholders were predominant. Poor rural farmers might often be tenants in one place and very small landlords in others. A blanket attack on zamindars, the landlords, would therefore damage the move towards social equality rather than advance it, he believed. Pant's political ideas were rarely expressed in theoretical terms, but he had long grappled with the question of laissez-faire and state intervention. we find him in vigorous dispute in 1936 with a finance member of the Indian government, Sir James Grigg. Pant argued that if Britain had already moved away from laissez-faire and was inspired in its program of house building by major economists and politicians such as Lloyd George, Roosevelt, John Maynard Keynes, and Harold Lasky, how is it that the Indian government still adhered to rigid ideas of small government? Pant invoked Sir Mokshagundam Visvaraya, who was trained as an engineer and had been treasurer of the Mysore state between 1912 and 19. Visvaraya had used state funds to promote large-scale irrigation works. He founded factories and educational institutions in Mysore, calling on Indian business to invest capital to promote rapid industrialization. As in the case of Nehru and P.C. Mahalanobis, whom I'll discuss presently, social, industrial, and scientific advance were deeply interconnected in Visvesvaraya's and Pant's understanding of economic planning. They both participated directly in the Nehruvian consensus on this issue and approved the Congress's creation of the National Planning Commission in 1938. So I now move on to Gadgil and Mahalanobis. If we move from Nehru's associates amongst the politicians and academics and public figures associated with the Planning Commission and the 3 5-year plans, a much more considered intellectual lineage becomes apparent. P.C. Mahalanobis, who founded the Indian Statistical Institute, represented above all a version of the tradition of Bengal scientific and mathematical modernism, which counted P.C. Rai among its luminaries. It was now turned outwards towards a more detailed statistical analysis of economic problems. In this respect, Mahalanobis believed that rural psychology needed to be totally transformed and orientated to constructive industrialism. Though Mahalanobis continued to talk to Radha Kamal Mukherjee and the earlier school of economic regionalists, he effectively turned their arguments on their heads. Mukherjee had insisted that small-scale industry had to be adjusted to the mentality of the peasant and that technical innovation had to be closely controlled so that, I quote, crimes against trees and water, i.e. an early form of ecology, could be avoided. The peasant was a total person, and this included his religious and cultural life. Mukherjee was, in effect, a more economically prescient and informed version of Gandhi. Such culturalism played little part in the planning regime of Mahalanobis, who insisted on the objective validity of scientific knowledge. Mahalanobis' brief but approving foreword to Devbrata Bose's Problems of Indian Society, published in 1968, makes it clear that he saw industrialization as a major force in loosening the country's caste hierarchy, which restricted economic growth. It would equalize wealth in the rural areas and weaken marriage restrictions by expanding opportunities between man and woman in industrial areas. Mahalanobis pointed to the steady increase in the number of intercaste and also Hindu-Muslim marriages. Detailed statistical knowledge, he implied, was essential to monitor such developments. Evidently, Mahalanobis drew on and transformed the contemporary transnational trend both towards centralized economic planning and the use of sample surveys and social statistics. He had encountered the work of the British social statistician and eugenicist Karl Pearson while studying mathematics and physics at Cambridge, where he also met the noted mathematician Ramanujan. His own statistical journal, Sankhya, Number, was modelled on Pearson's Biometrica. Equally, his great faith in the transformative capacity of heavy industry was reinforced by observation of the Soviet Union and later communist China, and also by conversations with noted European leftists such as J.B.S. Haldane and Joan Robinson. Yet at the same time, Mahalanobis was also representative of a specifically Indian rationalist tradition. Sankhya meant not only number, but something like a rational understanding of the universe. Mahalanobis' family, from the famous small Brahmin gentry of Bikrampur in East Bengal, now Bangladesh, of course, had converted to the rationalistic strain of the reforming Brahmo Samaj. His father was an activist in the widow remarriage campaign of the mid-19th century. Mahalanobis himself was connected with the Samaj throughout his life, opposing the reintroduction of rituals and paying homage to the memory of the founder of the Samaj, Ram Mohan Roy. In fact, it's striking how many of the Bengali intellectuals of the independence generation, including, of course, Satyajit Ray, the filmmaker, and Nirad Chaudhry, the self-declared unknown Indian, were Brahmas or were influenced by the Samaj. For his part, Mahalanobis declared that he was not a Hindu, but added paradoxically that he was a Brahmo by religion. He also revered the great Bengali sage Rabindranath Tagore, himself a covert Brahmo. So Mahalanobis's cultural and religious stance stood on that intriguing Indian cusp between panatheism and what might be called pantheism. As he once said, the human race would be improved by thinking about him who cannot be known by trying to know. Paradoxical statement. At any rate, for Mahalanobis, progress was dependent on knowledge of irrigation statistics, of educational statistics, in particular on statistics about the size, shape, and capabilities of people. In 1925, he published a paper on the characteristics of Calcutta's Anglo-Indians, based on measurements of skull size, nasal length, etc. He concluded that these families were the result of unions between upper caste Hindus and Europeans. Now, there's definitely a whiff of eugenics about this, and his later anthropometric study of the United Provinces, though he didn't display the almost pathological social Darwinism of his mentor, Pearson. Yet we see here an Indian colonization of what Nicholas Dirks has called the ethnographic state. Colonial observation of tribes and castes was appropriated and transformed into a national project by the Indian Statistical Institute and the National Sample Survey, which Mahalanobis led. All these statistical tools were deployed in support of Nehru's centralized economic planning. During the 1950s and early 1960s, though the promise of planning was at best stunted by regulation, red tape, and bureaucracy, the so-called Hermit Raj. Where Mahalanobis represented a particular style of Bengali scientific modernity, D.R. Gadgil's ideological stance in public life represented a coming together of three dominant strains of Western Indian political thought. First, he inherited the statistical liberalism of figures such as Nauroji and Telang, penning detailed analysis of rural improvement and impoverishment and writing the history of the Indian economy under colonial rule. Secondly, he was committed to the communitarian developmental liberalism of Gopal. Rural development, though through properly funded and directed rural cooperatives, was the key dimension of Gadgil's practical economic policy. He later became the first director of the Gokhale Institute in Pune. Finally, however, Gadgil was deeply influenced in his youth by the uncompromising nationalism of Bal Gangadhar Tilak, who was frequent visitor to the house of his maternal uncle. The young Gadgil met Tilak and read his Gita Rahasya, the commentary on the Bhagavad Gita which endorsed struggle and a new beginning. Perhaps Gadgil later came to see the economic struggles and political violence which set the young Republic of India on its way in the light of this work. V.M. Dandekar records that Gadgil had little sympathy with Gandhi's political stance, which he regarded as anti-intellectual, as the Indian Statistical Institute. Gadgil had in common with Mahalanobis a deep concern with statistics, but his interest lay in localized collections of data on farm sizes, indebtedness, the location of wells, and so on, as exemplified in his work on the environs of Pune. Gadgil also had an interest in the historical origins of inequality, which he had received the attention of Telang and R.C. Dutt in the 19th century. Gadgil's industrial evolution of India in recent times represented a more detailed but milder version of Nauroji's criticism in his Poverty and Un-British Rule in India of 1893. Gadgil argued that the administration lacked the human and local touch, and that it was bound by financial limitations and prejudices. Notably, he argued that even in times of boom and commercialization, poor farmers hamstrung themselves with debts which they couldn't pay off even during later periods of depression. Above all, the cooperative movement had failed to keep pace with either the limited economic expansion of the later 19th century or the Great Depression. Arguably then, it was the strain of economic and social thought derived from Gopal with its concern for agricultural cooperation, which was most significant for Gadgil. Throughout his academic and public career in the Planning Commission, he remained focused on attempts to fortify tenant right and peasant indebtedness. He was suspicious of the mathematical idea of the perfection of the market, which sometimes seems to have underpinned the approach of Mahalanobis himself. It was no accident that in addition to the Gokale connection, Gadgil recognized the economic thought of Harold Lasky, on one occasion giving the Lasky Memorial Lecture at the Lasky Institute of Political Science in Ahmedabad. Lasky's notion of decentralized guild socialism was very close to his own position. Moreover, Gadgil's notion of a specifically Indian form of localized social and economic development also seems quite close to Radha Kamal Mukherjee's economic regionalism, though devoid of its freight of religious rumination. Both men argued for the development of intermediate technology, as a term they actually use. Critically then, Gadgil occupied a median position between Gandhi's near-anarchic view of village self-government, spinning, and counter-industrialization, and the top-down program of Mahalanobis, or in the political sphere, state intervention in the form of reservations urged by B.R. Ambedkar. Mahalanobis wanted to reforge village habits and psychology, to force peasants to engage with the industrial outlook and an interest in tools, gadgetry, and new innovations. By contrast, Gadgil pressed for a softer, bottom-up version of local cooperation. Yet Gadgil remained in tune with Mahalanobis to the extent that they both saw local cooperation as a stage in development towards an industrial society rather than as an existentially desirable form of rural life, as did Gandhi and his supporters. These differing intellectual positions within Nehru's advisors reflected their various institutional and educational background and, as I've said, their ideologies. But it also seems likely that their regional context played a part too. Maharashtrian and Gujarati rural society had long been dominated by small independent landlords and substantial tenants who had shown continuous resistance to British land revenue policy, moneylenders, and urban intrusion. Gadgil must have realized that any over-centralized philosophy of economic planning could well have alienated them. By contrast, Mahalanobis' experience was drawn from Bengal and Bihar, where the peasantry had long been dominated by the state and the landlords. Here, village habits and psychology perhaps seemed more malleable. So I now move on to my final figure, Radhakrishna, Vedanta and the End of Conflict. The final member of Nehru's diverse circles discussed here is Sarvepalli Radhakrishnan, philosophy professor, Indian ambassador, and finally second president of the Republic. Radhakrishnan differed quite sharply from the other actors I've mentioned. If Gadgil and Mahalanobis distantly set their economic and social projects against the background of a Hindu or Brahmo idea of the progressive development of the human spirit, Radhakrishnan asserted with textual rigor, as Gopal wrote, that the divine was already present in the self and that the goal of cosmic evolution was the release of the imprisoned splendor in all men and women. If the ape could evolve into man, the human could become divine. As he stated in his Kamala lectures in Calcutta in 1942, Christianity was only one religion among many, and the West had forfeited all right to moral superiority through warfare and greed, a point he emphasized even more vigorously when the lectures were published in 1948 after the dropping of the atomic bomb. Radhakrishnan was in fact one of the last great of the counter-preachers, as I call them, the public men who turned the ideological tables on the West and placed Indian, or more precisely Vedantic Hindu belief and culture, at the apex of human achievement. This was a distinguished line stretching from Keshav Chandra Sen through Vivekananda to Gandhi himself. But Radhakrishnan's learning made it possible for him to mount a sustained intellectual challenge to Western theorists, while simultaneously employing idealist philosophers such as Henri Bergson to refute materialists, Marxists, and European cultural supremacists. Radhakrishnan urged and argued that Western philosophy needed to engage with a concept of spirit, so that ultimately Hegel trumped Marx, or indeed Shankara trumped the Sankhya tradition of hyper-rationalism. For Nehru, Radhakrishnan's worth was his ability to project at home and abroad the moral gravity and uniqueness of India. As a philosopher-statesman, he was one of the few who could take up Gandhi's own mantle after 1948. Yet Radhakrishnan's belief did more than simply legitimate the texture of politics. They actively informed it, whether as ambassador to the USSR and the UN or as president. In 1942, he praised the Atlantic Charter as a humane document that castigated Churchill for excluding colonial subjects and peoples from it. After the bomb fell, he used the Bhagavad Gita to urge humanity to retreat from the world's conflicts, reflect on the horrors of war, and return to the world armed with the spirit of Nishpal Karma, desireless action. This, of course, didn't rule out the necessity of principled war for Radhakrishnan any more than it did for his hero Arjuna. As the Cold War took hold, this attitude served the Republic of India well. In Moscow between 1949 and 1954, Radhakrishnan knew of the repression employed by Stalin. He nevertheless considered that centralized planning had brought great benefits to the Russian people, and the majority favored socialism. Above all, he urged accommodation and adjustment on both the Soviet Union and the West. Moral and political problems were rarely solved by armed conflict. In his mind, the late Vedantism, reminiscent of Vivekananda, informed the politics of non-alignment. As vice president, he urged the policy of developing the graces of mind and the virtues of spirit on the great powers, as well as on China and Vietnam. Radhakrishnan undoubtedly provided something powerful and different to Nehru's circle of policy advisors, a degree of spiritual gravitas. But it would be unrealistic to ignore the fact that this wasn't always a harmonious grouping. Quite apart from the conflicts over Hindu-Muslim relations, when Pant found himself on the wrong side of Nehru, or disagreements about the role of the free market, which went back to the days of Vallabhbhai Patel, there were also negative reactions to Radhakrishnan's patrician deportment. When the question came up of his succession as president to Rajendra Prasad, for instance, some politicians from the south told Nehru that they would rather have a president from another part of India than a Brahmin from Tamil Nadu, a reflection on the rise of non-Brahminism and the regionalism in the young republic. So, the end of an era. Historians and economists have been ambivalent, to say the least, about the legacy of the first 2 decades of independent India. As the initial spurt of GDP growth slowed in the mid-1950s, they began to articulate criticisms of the Nehruvian regime, which were later epitomized in the phases Permit Raj and the Hindu rate of growth. These criticisms of the policies of Nehru and his generation have persisted up to the present day, partly as a justification of the liberalization of the economy after 1990. So it's argued, aversion to dependence on Western aid made India equally dependent on the USSR, which was later revealed to be economically sclerotic itself. The emphasis on the expansion of state-run heavy industry choked off more efficient small production. Land reform was too limited to achieve any degree of income equalization, while the failure to tax large agrarian incomes left the state penniless. By 1962, Gadkal himself was pointing to the takeover of the country by what he called the ugly businessman, a trope which became more prominent during the rule of Indira Gandhi herself. Others argue that the preservation of caste reservations created a creamy layer of rich peasants which left behind vast swathes of the urban and agricultural poor. It also created a formalistic democracy at the mercy of identity politics. Nehru's hopes for world peace across a socialist ecumene were smashed by the wars in Korea, Vietnam, and most bitterly by India's own military failure in the conflict with socialist China. Imperialism, which the United Nations and the Bandung Pact were supposed to terminate, had taken a new lease of life with the Suez adventure and the war in Algeria. To Gopal, ending his final volume of the biography, Nehru seemed a prophet frustrated with his hopes unfulfilled. Yet we must avoid the infinite condescension of posterity. Firstly, it's clear from Nehru's own writings that he felt that the very survival of the fragile independent state was at risk for at least the first decade of his premiership. His policies were calculated responses to this danger. There was no easy transition from the steel frame of British rule to the governance of a stable republic. The trauma of partition had been followed by successive waves of refugees flooding across the new borders. It had also led to a mini-Cold War with Pakistan, interrupted by real conflict on 3 occasions. Separatist cries had been heard across the country in Kashmir, amongst the Sikhs of the Punjab in the northeast and in the south. These vociferous aspirations had been held in check by the brave and by no means predictable decision to institute universal suffrage. Moderate land reform had limited the communist-led movement which had surged into the open in the Telangana uprising of the late 1940s, but more radical reform might well have greatly increased the danger from separatists and sparked a reaction from the privileged, quite apart from shattering the fragile unity of the Congress itself. So many of the decisions on economic policy and social policy, rather than being half-hearted or indecisive, as critics then and now often allege, were reflections of Nehru's judgment. Yet, to sum up, the policies and politics of Nehru's era can't simply be reduced to political instrumentalism implemented in an atmosphere of fear. For Nehru and his circle also inherited a great weight of ideologies, sentiments, and prejudices, in Gadamer's sense of the word, from earlier Indian liberals, socialists, and anti-colonialists. These were precious doctrines precisely because they had originally been forged in the depths of a humiliating subjection to colonial rule. Alongside the often qualified support for heavy industry, for instance, Nehru's team instituted a system of local responsible government in the shape of the so-called Panchayati Raj. While historians have tended to dismiss this system as corrupt or as a failure, it was nevertheless ideologically critical and politically symbolic. To Nehru, this was the most revolutionary development in India. This was, I quote, real Swaraj of the people. His top-down approach to planning was always modified by personal experience of the self-empowered peasant associations which he'd encountered when he drove out from the city of Allahabad into the countryside in 1920 and 1921. Nehru believed, along with Pant, that, as one observer put it in 1920, the cry, all power to the panchayats, would presage a true recovering of liberties, unlike the case of the Russian Revolution. This was because the peasant associations would be affiliated to and mold the Congress Party rather than becoming its servile agents. These, though, were not Gandhi's village assemblies, but those of Gadgil's mentor, Gokhale, who always insisted on the significance of economically productive local cooperatives. To this pattern of ideas, Nehru similarly brought an insistence on women's rights, long adhered to in his own family, and a commitment to republicanism, which had also been favoured as a doctrine amongst sections of the elite for generations. These sentiments echoed the political philosophy of earlier Indian liberals and socialists. Equally, the centralising, statistically empowered drive for heavy industry, favoured by Mahalanobis, drew on the ideas of Indian political economists, stretching back at least to Nairoji, who insisted on tariff protection and the need to build up local units of production, even if they were initially less efficient than foreign ones. In the case of Radhakrishnan, a Vedantic urge for harmony and progress informed his contribution to Nehru's policy of non-alignment. Finally, Nehru himself subscribed to and yet modified a whole host of sometimes contradictory doctrines adjusted to that long-past age of the expert, which lay between the first atomic bomb and the launch of Sputnik. It was this age of aspiration and yet contradiction between elite intellectualism, centralization, and popular democracy, which Gopal exemplified so well in his life and work. Thank you.
Chris, I think that was a really perfect example of the kind of detailed reconstruction of the intellectual context and foundations of political ideas that have shaped modern India. And I think you've set a very high standard for future lecturers in this memorial lecture who will come after. So thank you very much. And there's drinks now downstairs on the second floor. If you turn left when you come out of the lift, you'll see where you're all welcome to join us. Thank you again.